Chapter 10, Part 4 of The Passionate Friends by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter the 10th. Mary Writes. 4. I did not answer Mary's letter for 7 or 8 days. During that period, my mind was full of her to the exclusion of every other interest. I reread all that she had to say many times, and with each reading, the effect of her personality deepened. It was all so intensely familiar, the flashes of insight, the blazing frankness, the quick turns of thought, and her absurd confidence in a sort of sane stupidity that she had always insisted upon my possessing, and her unembarrassed affectionateness. Her quick, irregular writing seemed to bring back with it the changing light in her eyes, the intonations of her voice, something of her gesture. I didn't go on discussing with myself whether we two ought to correspond. That problem disappeared from my thoughts. Her challenge to me to justify myself took possession of my mind. That thrust toward self-examination was the very essence of her ancient influence. How did I justify myself? I was under a peculiar compulsion to answer that to her satisfaction. She had picked me up out of my work and accumulating routines with that demand, made me look at myself and my world again as a whole. I had a case. I have a case. It is a case of passionate faith triumphing over every doubt and impossibility, a case real enough to understand for those who understand, but very difficult to state. I tried to convey it to her. I do not remember at all clearly what I wrote to her. It has disappeared from existence, but it was certainly a long letter. Throughout this book, I have been trying to tell you the growth of my views of life and its purpose, from my childish dreams and harbory attitudes to those ideas of human development that have made me undertake the work I do. It is not glorious work, I know, as the work of great artists and poets and leaders is glorious, but it is what I find best suits my gifts and my want of gifts. Greater men will come at last to build within my scaffoldings. In some summary phrasing, I must have set out the gist of this. I must have explained my sense of the supreme importance of mental clarification in human life. All this is manifest in her reply. And I think, too, I did my best to tell her plainly the faith that was in me, and why life seemed worthwhile to me. Her second letter came after an interval of only a few days from the despatch of mine. She began abruptly. I won't praise your letter or your beliefs. They are fine and large, and generous, like you. Just a little artificial, but you will admit that, as though you had felt them give here and there, and had made up your mind they shouldn't. At times it's oddly like looking at the Alps, the real Alps, and finding that every now and then the mountains have been eked out with a plank and canvas Earl's Court background. Yes, I like what you say about faith. I believe you are right. I wish I could. Perhaps some day I shall light up and feel you are right. But, that large, respectable project, the increase of wisdom and freedom and self-knowledge in the world, the calming of wars, the ending of economic injustice, and so on and so on. When I read it first, it was like looking at a man in profile and finding him solid and satisfactory, And then afterwards, when I thought it all over, and looked for the particular things that really matter to me, and tried to translate it into myself, nothing is of the slightest importance in the world that one cannot translate into oneself. Then I began to realize just how amazingly deficient you are. It was like walking round that person in profile, and finding his left side wasn't there, with everything perfect on the right, down to the buttons. A kind of intellectual Lorelei, sideways. You've planned out your understandings and tolerances and enquiries and clearings up as if the world were all just men, or citizens, and nothing doing but racial and national and class prejudices, and the exacting and shirking of labor, and you seem to ignore altogether that man is a sexual animal first. First, Stephen, first. That he has that in common with all the animals. That it made him indeed, because he has it more than they have. And after that, a long way after that, he is the labor-economizing, war and feud-making creature you make him out to be. A long way after that. Man is the most sexual of all the beasts, Stephen. Half of him, womankind, rather more than half, isn't simply human at all. It's specialized for the young, not only naturally and physically as animals are, but mentally and artificially. Womankind isn't human, it's reduced human. It's the sex, as the Victorians used to say. And from the point of view of the Lex Julia, and the point of view of Mr. Malthus, and the point of view of biologists and saints and artists, and everyone who deals in feeling and emotion, and from the point of view of all us poor specialists smothered up in our clothes and restrictions, the future of the sex is the center of the whole problem of the human future, about which you are concerned. All this great world-state of your man's imagination is going to be wrecked by us if you ignore us. We women are going to be the Goths and Huns of another decline and fall. We are going to sit in the conspicuous places of the world and loot all your patient accumulations. We are going to abolish your offspring, and turn the princes among you into undignified slaves. Because, you see, specialized as we are not quite specialized. We are specialized under duress. And at the first glimpse of a chance, we abandon our cradles and drop our pots and pans, and go for the vast and elegant side possibilities of our specialization. Out we come, looking for the fun the men are having. Dress us, feed us, play with us. We'll pay you an excitement, tremendous excitement. The state, indeed! All your little triumphs of science and economy, all your little accumulations of wealth, that you think will presently make the struggle for life an old story and the millennium possible. We spend. And all your dreams of brotherhood. We will set you by the ears. We hold ourselves up as my little Christian nephews, Philip's boys, do some coveted object, and say, quis? And the whole brotherhood shouts, ego, to the challenge. Back you go into individualism at the word, and all your brotherhood crumbles to dust again. How are you going to remedy it? How are you going to protect that great state of your dreams from this anti-citizenship of sex? You give no hint. You are planning nothing, Stephen, nothing to meet this. You are fighting with an army all looting and undisciplined, frantic with the private jealousies that center about us, feuds, cuts, expulsions, revenges, and you are giving out orders for an army of saints. You treat us as a negligible quantity, and we are about as negligible as a fire in the woodwork of a house that is being built. I read what I have written, Stephen, and I perceive I have the makings of a fine scold in me. Perhaps under happier conditions I should certainly have scolded you constantly, continually. Never did a man so need scolding. And like any self-respecting woman, I see that I use half my words in the wrong meanings in order to emphasize my point. Of course, when I write woman in all that has gone before, I don't mean woman. It is a woman's privilege to talk or write incomprehensibly and insist upon being understood. So that I expect you already to understand that what I mean isn't that men are creative and unselfish and brotherly and so forth, and that women are spoiling and going to spoil the game. Although and notwithstanding that is exactly what I have written, but that humans are creative and unselfish, etc., and so forth, and that it is their sexual, egotistical, passionate side, which is ever so much bigger relatively in a woman than in a man, and that is why I wrote as I did, which is going to upset your noble and beautiful apple cart. But it is not only that by nature we are more largely and gravely and importantly sexual than men, but that men have shifted the responsibility for attraction and passion upon us, and made us pay in servitude and restriction and blame for the common defect of the species. So that you see, really I was right all along in writing of this as though it was women when it wasn't, and I hope now it is unnecessary for me to make my meaning clearer than it is now and always has been in this matter. And so, resuming our discourse, Stephen, which only my sense of your invincible literalness could ever have interrupted, what are you going to do with us? I gather from a hint, rather than accept as a statement, that you propose to give us votes. Stephen, do you really think that we are going to bring anything to bear upon public affairs worth having? I know something of the contemporary feminine intelligence. Justin makes no serious objection to a large and various circle of women friends, and over my little sitting-room fire in the winter, and in my corners of our various gardens in the summer, and in walks over the heather at Martin's and in Scotland, there are great talks and confessions of love, of mental freedom, of ambitions, and belief and unbelief, more particularly of unbelief. I have sometimes thought of compiling a dictionary of unbelief, a great list of the things that a number of sweet, submissive, value-above-rubies wives have told me they did not believe in. It would amaze their husbands beyond measure. The state of mind of women about these things, Stephen, is dreadful. I mean, about all these questions. You know what I mean. The bold, striving spirits do air their views a little, and always in a way that makes one realize how badly they need airing. But most of the nicer women are very chary of talk. They have to be drawn out. A hint of opposition makes them start back or prevaricate. And I see them afterwards with their husbands, pretty, silken, furry, feathery, jeweled silences. All their suppression doesn't keep them orthodox. It only makes them furtive and crumpled and creased in their minds, in just the way that things get crumpled and creased if they are always being shoved back into a drawer. You have only to rout about in their minds for a bit. They pretend at first to be quite correct, and then out comes the nasty little courage of the darkness. Sometimes there is even an apologetic titter. They are quite emancipated, they say. I have misunderstood them. Their emancipation is like those horrid white lizards that grow in the Kentucky caves out of the sunlight. They tell you they don't see why they shouldn't do this or that. Mean things, underhand things, cheap, vicious, sensual things. Are there, I wonder, the same dreadful little caverns in men? I doubt it. And then comes a situation that really tries their quality. Think of the quandary I got into with you, Stephen. And for my sex, I'm rather a daring person. The way in which I went so far, and then ran away. I had a kind of excuse, in my illness. That illness, such a queer, untimely, feminine illness. We're all to pieces, Stephen. That's what brought down Rome. The women went to pieces then, and the women are going to pieces today. What's the good of having your legions and the Grampians and marching up to Filey, while the wives are talking treason in your houses? It's no good telling us to go back to the ancient virtues. The ancient virtues haven't kept. The ancient virtues in an advanced state of decay is what was the matter with Rome, and what is the matter with us. You can't tell a woman to go back to the spinning wheel and the kitchen and the cradle, when you have power looms, French cooks, hotels, restaurants, and modern nurseries. We've overflowed. We've got to go on to a lot of new virtues. And in all the prospect before me, I can't descry one clear, simple thing to do. But I'm running on. I want to know, Stephen, why you've got nothing to say about all this. It must have been staring you in the face ever since I spent my very considerable superfluous energies in wrecking your career. Because you know I wrecked it, Stephen. I knew I was wrecking it, and I wrecked it. I knew exactly what I was doing all the time. I had meant to be so fine a thing for you, a mothering friend, to have that dear consecutive kindly mind of yours steadying mine, to have seen you grow to power over men, me helping, me admiring. It was to have been so fine, so fine. Didn't I urge you to marry Rachel, make you talk of her? Don't you remember that? And one day, when I saw you thinking of Rachel, saw a kind of pride in your eyes, suddenly I couldn't stand it. I went to my room after you had gone, and thought of you and her until I wanted to scream. I couldn't bear it. It was intolerable. I was violent to my toilet things. I broke a hand-glass. Your dignified, selfish, self-controlled Mary smashed a silver hand mirror. I never told you that. You know what followed. I pounced on you and took you. Wasn't I a soft and scented hawk? Was either of us better than some creature of instinct that does what it does because it must? It was like a gust of madness. And I cared, I found, no more for your career than I cared for any other little thing, for honor, for Rachel, for Justin, that stood between us. My dear, wasn't all that time, all that heat and hunger of desire, all that secret futility of passion, the very essence of the situation between men and women now? We are all trying most desperately to be human beings, to walk erect, to work together. What was your phrase? In a multitudinous unity. To share what you call a common collective thought that shall rule mankind. And this tremendous force which seizes us and says to us, make that other being yours, bodily yours, mentally yours, wholly yours. At any price, no matter the price. Bars all our unifications. It splits the whole world into couples watching each other, until all our laws, all our customs seem the servants of that. It is the passion of the body swamping the brain. It's an ape that has seized a gun, a beautiful modern gun. Here am I, Justin's captive, and he mine. He mine because at the first escapade of his, I get my liberty. Here are we two, I and you, barred forever from the sight of one another, and I and you riding, I at any rate, in spite of the ill-concealed resentment of my partner. We're just two, peeping through our bars of a universal multitude. Everywhere this prison of sex. Have you ever thought just all that it means when every woman in the world goes dressed in a costume to indicate her sex, her cardinal fact, so that she dare not even mount a bicycle in knickerbockers? She has her hair grown long to its longest because yours is short, and everything conceivable is done to emphasize and remind us, and you, of the fundamental trouble between us, as if there was need of reminding. Stephen, is there no way out of this? Is there no way at all? Because if there is not, then I had rather go back to the harem than live as I do now, imprisoned in glass, with all of life inside of me and none in reach. I had rather Justin beat me into submission and mental tranquillity, and that I bore him an annual, probably deciduous, child. I can understand so well now that feminine attitude that implies, well, if I must have a master, then the more master the better. Perhaps that is the way, that nature will not let us poor humans get away from sex, and I am merely, what is it, an abnormality, with whiskers of enquiry sprouting from my mind. Yet I don't feel like that. I'm pouring into these letters, Stephen, the concentrated venom of years of brooding. My heart is black with rebellion against my lot and against the lot of woman. I have been given life and a fine position in the world. I made one fatal blunder in marrying to make these things secure, and now I can do nothing with it all, and I have nothing to do with it. It astounds me to think of the size of our establishment, Stephen, of the extravagant way in which whole counties and great countries pay tribute to pile up the gigantic heap of wealth upon which we too lead our lives of feudal entanglement. In this place alone there are 14 gardeners and garden helps, and this is not one of our garden places. 3 weeks ago I spent £1,000 on clothes in one great week of shopping, and our yearly expenditure upon personal effect, upon our magnificence and our margins, cannot be greatly less than £45,000. I walk about our house and gardens. I take one of the carriages or one of the automobiles, and go to some large pointless gathering of hundreds and thousands of pounds, and we walk about and say empty little things, and the servants don't laugh at us, the butlers don't laugh at us, the people in the street tolerate us. It has an effect of collective insanity. You know the story of one of those dear barons of the Cinque-Ports, a decent plumber body from Rye or Winchelsea, one of the 6 or 8 who claimed the privilege of carrying the canopy over the king. She is speaking of King Edward's coronation, of course. How that he was discovered suddenly to be speaking quite audibly to the sacred presence so near to him. It is very remarkable. We should be here, your Majesty. Very remarkable. And then he subsided, happily unheard, into hopeless embarrassment. That is exactly how I feel, Stephen. I feel I can't stand it much longer, that presently I shall splutter and spoil the procession. Perhaps I don't properly estimate our position in the fabric, but I can't get away from the feeling that everything in social life leads up to this, to us, the ridiculous canopy. If so, then the universe means nothing. It's blowing great forms and shapes as a swamp blows bubbles. A little while ago it was megatheriums and plesiosauriums, if that's the name for them, and now it is country houses and motor cars and coronation festivals. And in the end, it is all nonsense, Stephen. It is utter nonsense. If it isn't nonsense, tell me what it is. For me, at any rate, it's nonsense, and for every intelligent woman about me. For I talk to some of them, we indulge in seditious whisperings and wit, and there isn't one who seems to have been able to get to anything solider than I have done. Each of us has had her little fling at maternity, about as much as a washerwoman does in her odd time every 2 or 3 years, and that is our uttermost reality. All the rest, trimmings. We go about the world, Stephen, dressing and meeting each other with immense ceremony. We have our seasonal movements in relation to the ritual of politics and sport. We travel south for the budget and north for the grouse. We play games to amuse the men who keep us. Not a woman would play a game for its own sake. We dabble with social reform and politics, for which few of us care a rap except as an occupation. We discover artists or musicians or lecturers, as though we cared. We try to believe in lovers, or still harder, try to believe in old or new religions, and most of us, I don't, do our best to give the gratifications and exercise the fascinations that are expected of us. Something has to be done for women, Stephen. We are the heart of life, birth and begetting, the home where the future grows. And your schemes ignore us and slide about over the superficialities of things. We are spoiling the whole process of progress. We are turning all the achievements of mankind to nothingness. Men invent, create, do miracles with the world, and we translate it all into shopping, into a glitter of dresses and households, into an immense parade of pride and excitement. We excite men. We stir them to get us and keep us. Men turn from their ideas of brotherhood to elaborate our separate cages. I am Justin's wife. Not a thing in my heavens or my earth that is not subordinated to that. Something has to be done for women, Stephen. Something. Urgently. And nothing is done until that is done. Some release from their intolerable subjection to sex, so that for us everything else in life, respect, freedom, social standing, is entirely secondary to that. But what has to be done? We women do not know. Our efforts to know are among the most desolating of spectacles. I read the papers of those suffrage women. The effect is more like agitated geese upon a common than anything human has a right to be. That's why I turn to you. Years ago I felt, and now I know, there is about you a simplicity of mind, a foolishness of faith, that is stronger and greater than the cleverness of any woman alive. You are one of those strange men who take high and sweeping views, as larks soar. It isn't that you yourself are high and sweeping. No, but still I turn to you. In the old days I used to turn to you and shake your mind, and make you think about things you seemed too sluggish to think about without my clamor. Once, do you remember, at Marden's I shook you by the ears. And when I made you think, you thought, as I could never do. Think now, about women. Stephen, there are moments when it seems to me that this futility of women, this futility of men's effort through women, is a faded futility in the very nature of things. We may be saddled with it, as we are with all the animal infirmities we have, with appendixes and such-like things inside of us, and the passions and rages of apes, and a tail. I believe we have a tail curled away somewhere, haven't we? Perhaps mankind is so constituted that badly as they get along now, they couldn't get along at all if they let women go free and have their own way with life. Perhaps you can't have two sexes loose together. You must shut up one. I've a horrible suspicion that all these anti-suffrage men, like Lord Cromer and Sir Ray Lancaster, must know a lot about life that I do not know. and that other man, Sir Something or other Right, who said plainly that men cannot work side by side with women because they get excited. And yet, you know, women have had glimpses of a freedom that was not mischievous. I could have been happy as a lady abbess. I must have space and dignity, Stephen. And those women had things in their hands as no women have things in their hands today. They came to the House of Lords, but they lost all that. Was there some sort of natural selection? Stephen, you were made to answer my mind, and if you cannot do it, nobody can. What is your outlook for women? Are we to go back to seclusion, or will it be possible to minimize sex? If you are going to minimize sex, how are you going to do it? Suppression? There is plenty of suppression now. Increase or diminish the pains and penalties. My nephew, Philip's boy, Philip Christian, was explaining to me the other day that if you boil water in an open bowl, it just boils away, and that if you boil it in a corked bottle, it bangs everything to pieces, and you have, he says, to look out. But I feel that's a bad image. Boiling water isn't frantically jealous, and men and women are. But still, suppose you trained people not to make such an awful fuss about things. Now you train them to make as much fuss as possible. Oh, bother it all, Stephen! Where's your mind in these matters? Why haven't you tackled these things? Why do you leave it to me to dig these questions into you, like opening a reluctant oyster? Aren't they patent? You up and answer them, Stephen, or this correspondence will become abusive. End of Chapter 10, Part 4. Chapter 10, Parts 5 to 7 of The Passionate Friends by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter the 10th. Mary Writes. 5. It was true that I did ignore or minimize sexual questions as much as I could. I was forced now to think why I did this. That carried me back to those old days of passion, memories I had never stirred for many years. And I wrote to Mary that there was, indeed, no reason but a reasonable fear, that in fact I had dismissed them because they had been beyond my patience and self-control, because I could not think very much about them, without an egotistical reversion to the bitterness of my own case. And in avoiding them, I was only doing what the great bulk of men in business and men in affairs find themselves obliged to do. They train themselves not to think of the rights and wrongs of sexual life, not to tolerate liberties even in their private imaginations. They know it is like carrying a torch into a powder magazine. They feel they cannot trust their own minds beyond the experience, tested usages, and conventions of the ages, because they know how many of those who have ventured further have been blinded by mists and clouds of rhetoric, lost in inexplicable puzzles, and wrecked disastrously. There in those half-explored and altogether unsettled hinterlands lurk desires that sting like adders and hatreds cruel as hell. And then I went on. I do not clearly remember now the exact line of argument I adopted, to urge upon her that our insoluble puzzles were not necessarily insoluble puzzles for the world at large, that no one soldier fights anything but a partial battle, and that it wasn't an absolute condemnation of me to declare that I went on living and working for social construction, with the cardinal riddles of social order, so far as they affected her, unsolved? Wasn't I, at any rate, preparing apparatus for that huge effort at solution that mankind must ultimately make? Wasn't this dredging out and deepening of the channels of thought about the best that we could hope to do at the present time, seeing that to launch a keel of speculation prematurely was only to strand oneself among hopeless reefs and confusions? Better prepare for a voyage tomorrow than sail to destruction today. Whatever I put in that forgotten part of my letter was put less strikingly than my first admissions, and anyhow it was upon these that Mary pounced, to the disregard of any other point. "There you are," she wrote, with something like elation. "There is a tiger in the garden, and you won't talk or think about it for fear of growing excited. That is my grievance against so much historical and political and social discussion. Its hopeless futility because of its hopeless omissions. You plan the world's future, taking the women and children for granted, with egotistical sex, as you call it, a prowling monster, upsetting everything you do." But I will not give you that particular letter in its order, nor its successors. Altogether, she wrote me 22 letters, and I 1 or 2 more than that number to her. And, a thing almost inevitable in a discussion by correspondence, there is a lot of overlapping and recapitulation. Those letters spread over a space of nearly 2.5 years. Again and again she insists upon the monstrous exaggeration of the importance of sex in human life, and of the need of some reduction of its importance, and she makes the boldest experimental suggestions for the achievement of that end. But she comes slowly to recognize that there is a justification for an indirect attack, that sex and the position of women do not constitute the primary problem in that bristling system of riddles that lies like a hostile army across the path of mankind. And she realized, too, that through art, through science and literature, and the whole inquiring and creative side of man's nature, lies the path by which those positions are to be outflanked, and those eternal-looking impossibles and inconceivables overcome. Here is a fragment, saturated with the essence of her thought. 3/4 of her earlier letters are variations on this theme. "What you call social order, Stephen, all the arrangements seem to me to be built on subjection to sex, even more than they are built, as you say, on labor subjection. And this is an age of release. You say it is an age of release for the workers, and they know it. And so do the women, just as much. Wild hopes indeed! The workers' hopes are nothing to the women's. It is not only the workers who are saying, 'Let us go free, manage things differently, so that we may have our lives relieved from this intolerable burthen of constant toil.' But the women also are saying, 'Let us go free.' They are demanding release just as much from their intolerable endless specialization as females. The tramp on the roads who won't work, the swindler and the exploiter who contrive not to work, the strikers who throw down their tools, no longer for 2 pences and 6 pences, as you say, but because their way of living is no longer tolerable to them, and we women who don't bear children or work or help, we are all in one movement together. We are part of the general strike. I have been a striker all my life. We are doing nothing, by the 100,000. Your old social machine is working without us and in spite of us. It carries us along with it, and we are sand in the bearings. I'm not a wheel, Stephen, I'm grit. What you say about the reactionaries and suppressionists who would stifle the complaints of labor and crush out its struggles to be free is exactly true about the reactionaries and suppressionists who would stifle the discussion of the woman's position and crush out her hopes of emancipation. And here is a page of the peculiar doubt that was as characteristic of her as the quick changes of her eyes. It gives just that pessimistic touch that tempered her valiant adventurousness, that gave a color at last to the tragedy of her death. Have you ever thought, Stephen, that perhaps these repressionist people are righter than you are, that if the worker gets free, he won't work, and that if the woman gets free, she won't furl her sex and stop disturbing things? Suppose she is wicked as a sex. Suppose she will trade on her power of exciting imaginative men. A lot of these new women run with the hare and hunt with the hounds, beguile some poor innocent of a man to ruin them, and then call in fathers, brothers, husbands, friends, chivalry, all the rest of it, and make the best of both sides of a sex. Suppose we go on behaving like that, after we've got all our emancipations. Suppose that the liberation of common people simply means loafing, no discipline, nothing being done, an end to labor and the beginning of nothing to replace it, and that the liberation of women simply means the elaboration of mischief. Suppose that it is so. Suppose you are just tumbling the contents of the grate into the middle of the room. Then all this emancipation is a decay, even as conservative-minded people say. It's none the less a decay because we want it. And the only thing to stop it is to stop it, and to have more discipline and more suppression, and say to women and the common people, back to the sterner virtues, back to servitude. I wish I hadn't these reactionary streaks in my thoughts, but I have, and there you are. And then, towards the second year, her letters began to break away from her preoccupation with her position as a woman, and to take up new aspects of life, more general aspects of life altogether. It had an effect, not of her having exhausted the subject, but as if, despairing of a direct solution, she turned deliberately to the relief of other considerations. She ceased to question her own life, and, taking that for granted, wrote more largely of less tangible things. She remembered that she had said that life, if it was no more than its present appearances, was utter nonsense. She went back to that. "One says things like that," she wrote, "and not for a moment does one believe it. I grumble at my life. I seem to be always weakly and fruitlessly fighting my life, and I love it. I would not be willingly dead, for anything. I'd rather be an old matchwoman selling matches on a freezing night in the streets than be dead. Nothing nonsensical ever held me so tightly or kept me so interested. I suppose really I am full of that very same formless faith on which you rely. But with me it's not only shapeless, but intangible. I nibble at religion. I am immensely attracted. I stand in the doorway. Only when they come out to persuade me to come in, I am like a shy child and I go away. The temples beguile me, and the music, but not the men. I feel I want to join it, and they say join us. They are like vergers, such small things, such dreadful little arguing men. They don't let you come in. They want you to say they are right. All the really religious people seem to be outside nowadays. and all the pretending, cheating, atheistical, vain, and limited people within. But the beautiful things religion gives, the beauty! Do you know St. Paul, Stephen? Latterly I have been there time after time. It is the most beautiful interior in all the world, so great, so somberly dignified, so perfectly balanced, and filled with such wonderful music, brimming with music, just as crystal water brims in a bowl of crystal. The other day I went there, up into a little gallery high up under the dome, to hear Bach's Passion music, the St. Matthew Passion. One hangs high and far above the little multitudes below, the white-robed singers, the white-robed musicians, ranks and ranks, the great organ, the rows and rows and rows of congregation, receding this way, that way, into the haze of the aisle and the transepts. And out of it all streams the sound and the singing. It pours up past you like a river that rushes upward to some great sea, some unknown sea. The whole place is music and singing. I hang on to the railing, Stephen, and weep. I have to weep, and I wonder and wonder. One prays then as naturally as one drinks when one is thirsty and cold water comes to hand. I don't know whom I pray to, but I pray. Of course I pray. Latterly, Stephen, I have been reading devotional works, and trying to catch that music again. I never do, definitely. Never. But at times I put down the book, and it seems to me that surely a moment ago I heard it, that if I sit very still, in a moment I shall hear it again. And I can feel it is there. I know it is there, like a bat's cry, pitched too high for my ears. I know it is there, just as I should still know there was poetry somewhere, if some poor toothless idiot, with no roof to his mouth and no knowledge of any but the commonest words, tried to read Shelley to me. I wish I could pray with you, Stephen. I wish I could kneel down somewhere, with you of all people, and pray. 6. Presently our correspondence fell away. The gaps between our letters lengthened out. We never wrote regularly, because for that there must be a free exchange upon daily happenings, and neither of us cared to dwell too closely on our immediate lives. We had a regard for one another that left our backgrounds vague and shadowy. She had made her appeal across the sundering silences to me, and I had answered, and we had poured out certain things from our minds. We could not go on discussing. I was a very busy man now, and she did not write except on my replies. For a gap of nearly 4 months, neither of us had anything to say in a letter at all. I think that in time our correspondence might have altogether died away. Then she wrote again in a more familiar strain, to tell me of certain definite changes of relationship and outlook. She said that the estrangement between herself and Justin had increased during the past year, that they were going to live practically apart, she for the most part in the Surrey house, where her 2 children lived with their governesses and maids. But also she meant to snatch weeks and seasons for travel. Upon that they had been disputing for some time. "I know it is well with the children," she wrote. "Why should I be in perpetual attendance? I do nothing for them except an occasional kiss, or half an hour's romping. Why should one pretend? Justin and I have wrangled over this question of going away for weeks, but at last feminine persistence has won. I am going to travel in my own fashion and see the world, with periodic appearances at his side in London and Scotland. We have agreed at least on one thing, and that is upon a companion. She is to be my secretary in title, my moral guarantor, in fact, and her name, which is her crowning glory, is Stella Summersley Satchel. She is blonde, erect, huffy-mannered, and thoroughly up to both sides of her work. I partly envy her independence and rectitude, partly only. It's odd and quite inconsistent of me that I don't envy her altogether. In theory, I insist that a woman should not have charm. It is our undoing. But when I meet one without it... I shall also trail a maid, but I guess that young woman will learn what it is to be left behind in half the cities of Europe before I have done with her. I always lose my maids. They are so much more passive and forgettable than luggage. Abroad, that is. And Justin usually in the old days used to remember about them, and his valet used to see after them, a most attentive man. Justin cannot, he says, have his wife abroad with merely a companion. People would talk. Maid it must be as well. And so in a week or less I shall start, unusually tailor-made, for South Germany and all that jolly country, companioned and maided. I shall tramp, on the feet God has given me, in stout boots. Miss Summersley Satchel marches, I understand, like the British infantry, but on a vegetarian basis. Fancy calling your nourishment a basis. The Maid and so forth by Eilgut. 7. After the letter containing that announcement, she wrote to me twice again, once from Oban, and then, after a long interval, from Siena. The former was a scornfully minute description of the English at their holidays, and how the conversation went among the women after dinner. "They are like a row of Japanese lanterns, all blown out long ago and swinging about in a wind," she wrote. An extravagant image, that yet conveys something of the large, empty, unilluminating effect of a sort of social intercourse very vividly. In the second letter she was concerned chiefly with the natural beauty of Italy, and how latterly she had thrice wept at beautiful things, and what this mystery of beauty could be that had such power over her emotions. All up the hillside before the window as I write, the herbage is thick with anemones. They aren't scattered evenly and anyhow amongst the other things, but in little clusters and groups that die away and begin again, like the repetitions of an air in some musical composition. I have been sitting and looking at them for the better part of an hour, loving them more and then more, and the sweet sunlight that is on them and in among them. How marvelous are these things, Stephen! All these little exquisite things that are so abundant in the world, the gleaming lights and blossoms, the drifting scents. At times these things bring me to weeping. I can't help it. It is as if God, who is so stern and high, so terrible to all our appeals, took pity for a moment, and saw fit to speak very softly and tenderly. That was the last letter I was ever to have from her. Chapter 11, Parts 1 to 6 of The Passionate Friends by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter the 11th. The Last Meeting. 1. In the summer of 1911, immediately after the coronation of King George, there came one of those storms of international suspicion that ever and again threaten Europe with war. It seems to have been brewed by some German adepts at Weltpolitik, those privileged makers of giant bombs, who sit at the ears of foreign ministers suggesting idiotic wickedness, and it was brewed with a sublime ignorance of nearly every reality in the case. A German warship, without a word of notice, seized Agadir on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, within the regions reserved to French influence. An English demand for explanations was uncivilly disregarded, and England and France, and presently Germany, began vigorous preparations for war. All over the world, it was supposed that Germany had at last flung down the gauntlet. In England, the war party was only too eager to grasp what it considered to be a magnificent opportunity. Heaven knows what the Germans had hoped or intended by their remarkable coup. The amazing thing to note is that they were not prepared to fight. They had not even the necessary money ready, and they could not get it. They had perhaps never intended to fight, and the autumn saw the danger disperse again into diplomatic bickerings and insincerely pacific professions. But in the high summer the danger had not dispersed, and in common with every reasonable man, I found myself under the shadow of an impending catastrophe that would have been none the less gigantic and tragic because it was an imbecility. It was an occasion when everyone needs must act, however trivially disproportionate his action may be to the danger. I cabled Gidding, who was in America, to get together whatever influences were available there upon the side of pacific intervention, and I set such British organs as I could control or approach in the same direction. It seemed probable that Italy would be drawn into any conflict that might ensue. It happened that there was to be a conference of peace societies in Milan early in September, and thither I decided to go, in the not very certain hope that out of that assemblage some form of European protest might be evolved. That August I was very much run down. I had been staying in London through almost intolerably hot weather to attend a races congress that had greatly disappointed me. I don't know particularly now why I had been disappointed, nor how far the feeling was due to my being generally run down by the pressure of detailed work and the stress of thinking about large subjects in little scraps of time. But I know that a kind of despair came over me as I sat and looked at that multicolored assembly, and heard in succession the heavy platitudes of white men, the slick, thin cleverness of Hindus, the rich-toned, florid rhetoric of Negroes. I lost sight of any germ of splendid possibility in all those people, and saw all too plainly the vanity, the jealousy, the self-interests that show up so harshly against the professions of every altruistic movement. It seemed all such a windy business, against the firm prejudices, the vast accumulated interests that grind race against race. We had no common purpose at all at that conference, no proposal to hold us together. So much of it was like bleeding on a hillside. I wanted a holiday badly, and then came this war crisis, and I felt unable to go away for any length of time. Even bleeding, it seemed to me, was better than acquiesce in a crime against humanity. So to get heart to bleat at Milan, I snatched at 10 days in the Swiss mountains en route. A tour with some taciturn guide involving a few middling climbs and glacier excursions, seemed the best way of recuperating. I had never had any time for Switzerland since my first exile there years ago. I took the advice of a man in the club whose name I now forget, if ever I knew it, a dark man with a scar, and went up to the Schwarzeg hut above Grindelwald, and over the Strahleg to the Grimsel. I had never been up into the central mass of the Bernese Oberland before, and I was amazed and extraordinarily delighted by the vast lonely beauty of those interminable uplands of ice. I wished I could have lingered up there. But that is the tragedy of those sunlit desolations. One may not stay. One sees and exclaims, and then looks at a watch. I wonder no one has ever taken an Arctic equipment up into that wilderness, and had a good healing spell of lonely exaltation. I found the descent from the Strahleg as much of a climb as I was disposed to undertake. For an hour we were coming down frozen snow that wasn't so much a slope as a slightly inclined precipice. From the Grimsel I went over the Rhone glacier to the inn on the Furka Pass, and then, paying off my guide and becoming frankly a pedestrian, I made my way round by the Schulinen Gorge to Goskinen, and over the Sustenjak to the Susten Pass and Stein, meaning to descend to Meiringen. But I still had 4 days before I went on to Italy, and so I decided to take one more mountain. I slept at the Stein Inn, and started in the morning to do that agreeable first mountain of all, the Titlis, whose shining genial head attracted me. I did not think a guide necessary, but a boy took me up by a track near Godman, and left me to my Siegfried map some way up the great ridge of rocks that overlooks the Engstlen Alp. I a little overestimated my mountaineering, and it came about that I was benighted while I was still high above the Jock Pass on my descent. Some of this was steep and needed caution. I had to come down slowly with my folding lantern, in which a reluctant candle went out at regular intervals, and I did not reach the little inn at Engstlen Alp until long after 11 at night. By that time I was very tired and hungry. They told me I was lucky to get a room. Only one stood vacant. I should certainly not have enjoyed sleeping on a billiard table after my day's work, and I ate a hearty supper, smoked for a time, meditated emptily, and went wearily to bed. But I could not sleep. Usually I am a good sleeper, but ever and again when I have been working too closely or overexerting myself, I have spells of wakefulness. And that night, after perhaps an hour's heavy slumber, I became thinly alert and very weary in body and spirit, and I do not think I slept again. The pain in my leg that the panther had torn had been revived by the day's exertion. For the greater part of my life, insomnia has not been disagreeable to me. In the night, in the stillness, one has a kind of detachment from reality. One floats there without light, without weight, feeling very little of one's body. One has a certain disembodiment, and one can achieve a magnanimity of thought, forgiveness, and self-forgetfulness that are impossible while the body clamours upon one's senses. But that night, because, I suppose, I was so profoundly fatigued, I was melancholy and despondent. I could feel again the weight of the great beast upon me as he clawed me down, and I clung, desperately, in that interminable instant before he lost his hold. Yes, I was extraordinarily wretched that night. I was filled with self-contempt and self-disgust. I felt that I was utterly weak and vain, and all the pretensions and effort of my life mere florid, fruitless pretensions, and nothing more. I had lost all control over my mind. Things that had seemed secondary before became primary. Difficult things became impossible things. I had been greatly impeded and irritated in London by the manoeuvres of a number of people who were anxious to make capital out of the crisis, self-advertising people who wanted at any cost to be lifted into a position of unique protest. You see, that unfortunate Nobel Prize has turned the advocacy of peace into a highly speculative profession. The qualification for the winner is so vaguely defined that a vast multitude of voluntary idealists has been created, and a still greater number diverted from the unendowed pursuit of human welfare in other directions. Such a man as myself, who is known to command a considerable publicity, is necessarily a prey to those moral entrepreneurs. All sorts of ridiculous and petty incidents had forced this side of public effort upon me, but hitherto I had been able to say, with a laugh or sigh as the case warranted, "So much is dear old humanity, and all of us," and to remember the great residuum of nobility that remained. Now, that last saving consideration refused to be credible. I lay with my body and my mind in pain, thinking these people over, thinking myself over too, with the rest of my associates, thinking drearily and weakly, recalling spites, dishonesties, and vanities, feuds and absurdities, until I was near persuaded that all my dreams of wider human understandings, of great ends beyond the immediate aims and passions of common everyday lives, could be, at best, no more than the refuge of shy and weak and ineffective people from the failure of their personal lives. We idealists are not jolly people, not honest, simple people. The strain tells upon us. Even to ourselves we are unappetizing. Aren't the burly, bellowing fellows, after all, Ryder, with their simple natural hostility to everything foreign, their valiant hatred of everything unlike themselves, their contempt for aspiring weakness, their beer and lush sentiment, their here today and gone tomorrow conviviality and fellowship? Good fellows! While we others, lost in filmy speculations, in moon and star-snaring and the chase of dreams, stumble where even they walk upright. You know I have never quite believed in myself, never quite believed in my work or my religion. So it has always been with me, and always, I suppose, will be. I know I am purblind. I know I do not see my way clearly, nor very far. I have to do with things imperfectly apprehended. I cannot cheat my mind away from these convictions. I have a sort of hesitation of the soul, as other men have a limp in their gait. God, I suppose, has a need for lame men. God, I suppose, has a need for blind men, and fearful and doubting men, and does not intend life to be altogether swallowed up in staring sight. Some things are to be reached best by a hearing that is not distracted by any clearer senses. But so it is with me, and this is the innermost secret I have to tell you. I go on valiantly for the most part, I know, but despair is always near to me. In the common hours of my life, it is as near as a shark may be near a sleeper in a ship. The thin, effectual plank of my deliberate faith keeps me secure. But in these rare distresses of the darkness, the plank seems to become transparent, to be on the verge of dissolution. a sense of life as of an abysmal flood, full of cruelty, densely futile, blackly aimless, penetrates my defenses. I don't think I can call these stumblings from conviction unbelief. The limping man walks for all his limping, and I go on in spite of my falls. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. I fell into an inconsecutive review of my life, under this light that touched every endeavor with the pale tints of failure. And as that flow of melancholy reflection went on, it was shot more and more frequently with thoughts of Mary. It was not a discursive thinking about Mary, but a definite fixed direction of thought towards her. I had not so thought of her for many years. I wanted her, I felt, to come to me and help me out of this distressful pit into which my spirit had fallen. I believed she could. I perceived our separation as an irreparable loss. She had a harder, clearer quality than I, a more assured courage, a readier, surer movement of the mind. Always she had lift for me. And then I had a curious impression that I had heard her voice calling my name, as one might call out in one's sleep. I dismissed it as an illusion, and then I heard it again, so clearly that I sat up and listened, breathless. Mixed up with all this was the intolerable uproar and talking of a little cascade not 50 yards from the hotel. It is curious how distressing that clamor of running water, which is so characteristic of the Alpine night, can become. At last those sounds can take the likeness of any voice whatever. The water, I decided, had called to me, and now it mocked and laughed at me. The next morning I descended at some late hour by Swiss reckoning, and discovered 2 ladies in the morning sunlight, awaiting breakfast at a little green table. One rose slowly at the side of me, and stood and surveyed me with a glad amazement. 2. There she stood, real and solid, a little unfamiliar in her tweeds, and with her shining eyes intimate and unforgettable, as though I had never ceased to see them for all those intervening years. And bracing us both and holding back our emotion was, quite unmistakably, Miss Summersley Satchel, a blonde, business-like young woman, with a stumpy nose, very cruelly corrugated, and inflamed by a pince-nez that savagely did much more than its duty by its name. She remained seated, tilting her chair a little, pushing herself back from the table and regarding me intelligently. It was one of those moments in life when one is taken unawares. I think our common realization of the need of masking the reality of our encounter, the hasty search in our minds for some plausible face upon this meeting, must have been very obvious to the lady who observed us. Mary's first thought was for a pseudonym. Mine was to make it plain we met by accident. "It's Mr. Stephen," said Mary. "It's you. Dropped out of the sky. From over there. I was benighted and got there late." "Very late?" "One gleam of light, and a yawning waiter, or I should have had to break windows. And then I meet you." Then for a moment or so we were silent, with our sense of the immense gravity of this position growing upon us. A little tow-headed waiter-boy appeared with our coffee and rolls on a tray poised high on his hand. "You'll have your coffee out here with us," said Mary. "Where else?" said I, as though there was no conceivable alternative, and told the tow-headed waiter. Belatedly, Mary turned to introduce me to her secretary. "My friend, Miss Summersley Satchel. Mr. Stephen." Miss Satchel and I bowed to each other, and agreed that the lake was very beautiful in the morning light. "Mr. Stephen," said Mary, in entirely unnecessary explanation, "is an old friend of my mother's, and I haven't seen him for years. How is Mrs. Stephen, and the children?" I answered briefly, and began to tell of my climb down the Titlis. I addressed myself with unnecessary explicitness to Miss Satchel. I did perhaps over-accentuate the extreme fortuitousness of my appearance. From where I stood, the whole course of the previous day after I had come over the shoulder was visible. It seemed a soft little shining pathway to the top, but the dangers of the descent had a romantic intensification in the morning light. "The rule of the game," said I, "is that one stops and waits for daylight. I wonder if anyone keeps that rule." We talked for a time of mountains, I still standing a little aloof until my coffee came. Miss Summersley Satchel produced that frequent and most unpleasant by-product of a British education, an intelligent interest in etymology. "I wonder," she said, with a brow of ruffled omniscience, and eyeing me rather severely with a magnified eye, "why it is called Titlis. There must be some reason." Presently Miss Satchel was dismissed indoors on a transparent excuse, and Mary and I were alone together. We eyed one another gravely, perhaps all the more gravely because of the wild excitement that was quickening our pulse and breathing, and thrilling through our nerves. She pushed back the plate before her, and put her dear elbows on the table, and dropped her chin between her hands in an attitude that seemed all made of little memories. "I suppose," she said, "something of this kind was bound to happen." She turned her eyes to the mountains shining in the morning light. "I'm glad it has happened in a beautiful place. It might have been anywhere." "Last night," I said, "I was thinking of you and wanting to hear your voice again. I thought I did." "I too. I wonder if we had some dim perception." She scanned my face. "Stephen, you're not much changed. You're looking well. But your eyes, they're dog-tired eyes. Have you been working too hard?" "A conference. What did you call them once? A Carnegie-ish conference in London. Hot weather and fussing work and endless hours of weak, grey, dusty speeches. And perhaps that clamour over there yesterday was too much. It was too much. In India I damaged a leg. I had meant to rest here for a day." "Well, rest here." "With you?" "Why not, now you are here?" "But, after all, we've promised." "It's none of our planning, Stephen." "It seems to me I ought to go right on, so soon as breakfast is over." She weighed that with just the same still pause, the same quiet moment of lips and eyes that I recalled so well. It was as things had always been between us, that she should make her decision first, and bring me to it. "It isn't natural," she decided, "with the sun rising and the day still freshly beginning, that you should go or that I should go. I've wanted to meet you like this and talk about things 10,000 times, And as for me, Stephen, I won't go. And I won't let you go if I can help it. Not this morning, anyhow. No, go later in the day if you will, and let us two take this one talk that God himself has given us. We've not planned it. It's his doing, not ours. I sat, yielding. I am not so sure of God's participation, I said, but I know I am very tired, and glad to be with you. I can't tell you how glad. So glad. I think I should weep if I tried to say it. 3, 4, 5 hours, perhaps? Even if people know. Is it so much worse than 30 minutes? We've broken the rules already. We've been flung together. It's not our doing, Stephen. A little while longer adds so little to the offense, and means to us. Yes, I said, but if Justin knows. He won't. Your companion? There was the briefest moment of reflection. She's discretion itself, she said. Still, if he's going to know, the harm is done. We may as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb. And he won't know. No one will know. The people here. Nobody's here. Not a soul who matters. I doubt if they know my name. No one ever talks to me. I sat in the bright sunshine, profoundly enervated and quite convinced, but still maintaining out of mere indolence a show of hesitation. You take the good things God sends you, Stephen, as I do. You stay and talk with me now, before the curtain falls again. We've tired of letters. You stay and talk to me. Here we are, Stephen, and it's the one chance that is ever likely to come to us in all our lives. We'll keep the point of honor, and you shall go today. But don't let's drive the point of honor into the quick. Go easy, Stephen, old friend. My dear, what has happened to you? Have you forgotten? Of course. Is it possible for you to go, mute, with so much that we can say? And these mountains, and this sunlight? I looked up to see her with her elbows on the table, and her hands clasped under her chin, that face close to mine, her dear blue eyes watching me, and her lips a little apart. No other human being has ever had that effect upon me, so that I seem to feel the life and stir in that other body more than I feel my own. 3. From the moment when I confessed my decision to stay, we gave no further thought to the rightfulness or wisdom of spending the next few hours together. We thought only of those hours. Things lent themselves to us. We stood up and walked out in front of the hotel, and there, moored to a stake at the edge of the water, was a little leaky punt, the one vessel on the Angstlandsee. We would take food with us, as we decided, and row out there to where the vast cliffs came sheer from the water, out of earshot or interference, and talk for all the time we had. And I remember now how Mary stood and called to Miss Satchel's window to tell her of this intention, and how I discovered again that exquisite slender grace I knew so well. You know, the very rowing out from the shore had in it something sweet and incredible. It was as if we were but dreaming together, and might at any moment awaken again, countless miles and 1,000 things apart. I rowed slowly with those clumsy Swiss oars that one must thrust forward, breaking the smooth crystal of the lake, and she sat sideways looking forward, saying very little, and with much the same sense, I think, of enchantment and unreality. And I saw now for the first time as I watched her over my oars that her face was changed. She was graver, and, I thought, stronger than the Mary I had known. Even now I can still doubt if that boat and lake were real. And yet I remember even minute and irrelevant details of the day's impressions with an extraordinary and exquisite vividness. Perhaps it is that very luminous distinctness which distinguishes these events from the common experiences of life, and puts them so above the quality of things that are ordinarily real. We rowed slowly past a great headland, and into the bay at the upper end of the water. We had not realized at first that we could row beyond the range of the hotel windows. The rock that comes out of the lake is a clear dead white when it is dry, and very faintly tinted. But when it is wetted, it lights warmly with flashes and blotches of color, and is seen to be full of the most exquisite and delicate veins. It splinters vertically and goes up in cliffs, very high and sculptured, with a quality almost of porcelain, that at a certain level suddenly become more rude and massive and begin to overhang. Under the cliffs the water is very deep and blue-green, and runs here and there into narrow clefts. This place where we landed was a kind of beach left by the recession of the ice. All the rocks immediately about us were ice-worn, and the place was paved with ice-worn boulders. 2 huge bluffs put their foreheads together above us, and hid the glacier from us, but one could feel the near presence of ice in the air. Out between them boiled a little torrent, and spread into 100 intercommunicating channels amidst the great pebbles. And those pebbles were covered by a network of marvelously gnarled and twisted stems, bearing little leaves and blossoms, a network at once very ancient and very fresh, giving a peculiar gentleness and richness to the alpine severity that had dwarfed and tangled them. It was astounding that any plant could find nourishment among those stones. The great headland, with patches of yellowish old snow still lingering here and there upon its upper masses, had crept insensibly between us and the remote hotel, and now hid it altogether. There was nothing to remind us of the world that had separated us, except that old and leaky boat we had drawn up upon the stones at the limpid water's edge. "It is as if we had come out of life together," she whispered, giving a voice to my thought. She sat down upon a boulder, and I sat on a lower slab a yard or so away, and we looked at one another. "It's still unreal," she said. I felt awkward and at a loss as I sat there before her, as a man unused to drawing-rooms might feel in the presence of a strange hostess. "You are so you," I said, "so altogether my nearest thing. And so strange, too, so far off, that I feel shy." "I'm shy," I repeated. "I feel that if I speak loudly, all this will vanish." I looked about me. "But surely this is the most beautiful place in the whole world. Is it indeed in the world?" "Stephen, my dear," she began presently, "what a strange thing life is. Strange! The disproportions! The things that will not fit together. The little things that eat us up, and the beautiful things that might save us and don't save us. don't seem indeed to have any meaning in regard to ordinary sensible affairs. This beauty. Do you remember, Stephen, how long ago in the old park you and I talked about immortality, and you said then you did not want to know anything of what comes after life? Even now, do you want to know? You are too busy, and I am not busy enough. I want to be sure, not only to know, but to know that it is so, that this life, no, not this life, but that life, is only the bleak twilight of the morning. I think death, just dead death, after the life I have had, is the most impossible of ends. You don't want particularly? I want to passionately. I want to live again, out of this body, Stephen, and all that it carves with it, to be free as beautiful things are free, to be free as this is free, an exquisite, clean freedom. I can't believe that the life of this earth is all that there is for us, or why should we ever think it strange? Why should we still find the ordinary, matter-of-fact things of every day strange? We do, because they aren't us. Eating, stuffing into ourselves thin slices of what were queer little hot and eager beasts, the perpetual need to do such things, and all the mad fury of sex, Stephen. We don't live, we suffocate in our living bodies. They storm and rage and snatch. It isn't us, Stephen, really. It can't be us. It's all so excessive. If it is anything more than the first furious rush into existence of beings that will go on at last to quite beautiful, real things, like this perhaps. Today the world is beautiful indeed, with the sun shining and love shining, and you, my dear, so near to me. It's so incredible that you and I must part today. It's as if someone told me the sun was a little mad. It's so perfectly natural to be with you again. Her voice sank. She leant a little forward towards me. Stephen, suppose that you and I were dead today. Suppose that when you imagined you were climbing yesterday, you died. Suppose that yesterday you died, and that you just thought you were still climbing as you made your way to me. Perhaps you are dead up there on the mountain, and I am lying dead in my room in this hotel, and this is the great beginning. Stephen, I am talking nonsense, because I am so happy to be with you here. 4. For a time we said very little. Then, irregularly, disconnectedly, we began to tell each other things about ourselves. The substance of our lives seemed strangely objective that day. We had, as it were, come to one another clean out of our common conditions. She told me of her troubles and her secret weaknesses. We bared our spirits and confessed. Both of us had the same tale of mean and angry and hasty impulses. Both of us could find kindred inconsistencies. Both had an exalted assurance that the other would understand completely, and forgive and love. She talked for the most part. She talked much more than I, with a sort of wonder at the things that had happened to her. And for long spaces we did not talk at all, nor feel the need of talking. And what seems very strange to me now, seeing that we had been impassioned lovers, we never kissed. We never kissed at all. I do not even remember that I thought of kissing her. We had a shyness between us that kept us a little apart, and I cannot remember that we ever touched one another except that for a time she took me and led me by the hand towards a little place of starry flowers that had drawn her eyes and which she wished me to see. Already for us two, our bodies were dead and gone. We were shy of any contact. We were a little afraid of one another. There was a kind of awe between us that we had met again. And in that strange and beautiful place, her fancy that we were dead together had a fitness that I cannot possibly convey to you. I cannot give you by any writing the light and the sweet freshness of that high desolation. You would need to go there. What was lovely in our talk, being said in that setting, would seem but a rambling discourse were I to write it down. As I believe that even now I could write it down, word for word almost, every thought of it, so fresh does it remain with me. My dear, some moments are eternal. It seems to me that as I write to tell you of this, I am telling you not of something that happened 2 years ago, but of a thing immortal. It is as if I and Mary were together there, holding the realities of our lives before us, as though they were little sorry tales, written in books upon our knees. 5. It was still in the early afternoon that we came down again across the meandering ice-water streams to our old boat, and pushed off and rowed slowly out of that magic corner, back to every day again. Little we knew to what it was we rowed. As we glided across the water and rounded the headland and came slowly into view of the hotel again, Mary was reminded of our parting, and for a little while she was disposed to make me remain. "If you could stay a little longer," she said, "another day, if any harm is done, it's done." "It has been beautiful," I said, "this meeting. It's just as if, when I was so jaded and discouraged that I could have put my work aside and despaired altogether, some power had said, 'Have you forgotten the friendship I gave you?' But we shall have had our time. We've met. We've seen one another. We've heard one another. We've hurt no one. Will you go? Today, before sunset. Isn't it right that I should go?" "Stay," she whispered, with a light in her eyes. "No, I dare not." She did not speak for a long time. "Of course," she said at last, "you're right. You only said. I would have said it for you if you had not. You're so right, Stephen. I suppose, poor silly little things, that if you stayed we should certainly begin making love to each other. It would be necessary. We should fence about a little, and then there it would be, no barrier to stop us. And neither of us wants it to happen. It isn't what we want. You would become urgent, I suppose, and I should be coquettish. In spite of ourselves, that power would make us puppets, as if already we hadn't made love. I could find it in my heart now. Stephen, I could make you stay. Oh, why are we so tormented, Stephen? In the next world we shall meet, and this will trouble us no longer. The love will be there. Oh, the love will be there, like something that has at last got itself fully born, got itself free from some queer clinging seed case. We shall be rid of jealousy, Stephen, that inflammation of the mind, that bitterness, that pitiless sore. so that I shan't be tormented by the thought of Rachel, and she will be able to tolerate me. She was so sweet and wonderful a girl, with those dark eyes, and I've never done her justice, never, nor she me. I snatched you from her. I snatched you. Some day we shall be different. All this putting oneself round another person like a fence, against everyone else, almost against everything else. It's so wicked, so fierce. It's so possible to be different. Sometimes for long parts of a day, I have no base passions at all, even in this life. To be like that always. But I can't see clearly how these things can be. One dreams of them in a kind of luminous mist, and if one looks directly at them, they vanish again. 6. And at last we came to the landing, and moored the little boat, and walked up the winding path to the hotel. The dull pain of separation was already upon us. I think we had forgotten Miss Summersley Satchel altogether, but she appeared as we sat down to tea at that same table at which we had breakfasted, and joined us as a matter of course. Conceivably she found the two animated friends of the morning had become rather taciturn. Indeed, there came a lapse of silence so portentous that I roused myself to effort, and told her, all over again as I realized afterwards, the difficulties that had benighted me upon Titlis. Then Miss Satchel regaled Mary with some particulars of the various comings and goings of the hotel. I became anxious to end this tension, and went into the inn to pay my bill and get my knapsack. When I came out, Mary stood up. "I'll come just a little way with you, Stephen," she said, and I could have fancied the glasses of the companion flashed to hear the surname of the morning reappear a Christian name in the afternoon. "Is that woman behind us safe?" I asked, breaking the silence as we went up the mountainside. Mary looked over her shoulder for a contemplative second. "She's always been discretion itself." We thought no more of Miss Satchel. "This parting," said Mary, "is the worst of the price we have to pay. Now it comes to the end, there seem 1,000 things one hasn't said." And presently she came back to that. "We shan't remember this so much, perhaps. It was there we met, over there in the sunlight, among those rocks. I suppose, perhaps, we managed to say something." As the ascent grew steeper, it became clear that if I was to reach the Milksay Inn by nightfall, our moment for parting had come. And with a "Well," and a white-lipped smile, and a glance at the Argus-eyed hotel, she held out her hand to me. "I shall live on this, Brother Stephen," she said, "for years." "I too," I answered. It was wonderful to stand and face her there, and see her real and living, with the warm sunlight on her, and her face one glowing tenderness. We clasped hands. All the warm life of our hands met, and clung, and parted. I went on alone up the winding path. It zigzags up the mountainside, in full sight of the hotel for the better part of an hour, climbing steadily higher, and looking back, until she was just a little strip of white, that halted and seemed to wave to me. I waved back, and found myself weeping. "You fool!" I said to myself. "Go on!" and it was by an effort that I kept on my way, instead of running back to her again. Presently the curvature of the slope came up between us, and hid her altogether, hid the hotel, hid the lakes and the cliffs. It seemed to me that I could not possibly see her any more. It was as if I knew that sun had set forever. End of chapter. Chapter 11, Parts 7 to 12 of The Passionate Friends by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter the 11th, The Last Meeting. 7. I lay at the Milksay Inn that night, and rose betimes, and started down that wild grey gorge in the early morning light. I walked to Sachsen, caught an early train to Lucerne, and went on in the afternoon to Como. And there I stayed in the sunshine, taking a boat and rowing alone far up the lake, and lying in it, thinking of love and friendship, and the accidents and significance of my life, and for the most part not thinking at all, but feeling the glow of our meeting and the finality of our separation, as one feels the clear glow of a sunset when the wind rises and the cold night air draws near. Everything was pervaded by the sense of her. Just over those mountains, I thought, is Mary. I was alone in my boat, but her presence filled the sky. It seemed to me that at any moment I could go to her. And the last vestige of any cloud between us, for anything we had done or failed to do in those crises of distress and separation, had vanished and gone altogether. In the afternoon I wrote to Rachel. I had not written to her for 3 days, and even now I told her nothing of my meeting with Mary. I had not written, partly because I could not decide whether I should tell her of that or not. In the end I tried to hide it from her. It seemed a little thing in regard to her, a thing that could not hurt her, a thing as detached from her life and as inconsecutive as a dream in my head. 3 days later I reached Milan, a day before the formal opening of the Peace Congress. But I found a telegram had come that morning to the Poste Restante to banish all thought of my Pacific mission from my mind. It came from Paris, and its blue ribbon of text ran, "Come back at once to London. Justin has been told of our meeting, and is resolved upon divorce. Will do all in my power to explain and avert, but feel you should know at once." There are some things so monstrously destructive to all we hold dear, that for a time it is impossible to believe them. I remember now that as I read that amazing communication through, at the first reading it was a little difficult to understand, because the Italian operator had guessed at 1 or 2 of the words. No real sense of its meaning came to me. That followed sluggishly. I felt as one might feel when one opens some offensive anonymous letter, or hears some preposterous threat. "What nonsense!" I said, faint-heartedly. I stood for a time at my bedroom window, trying to shake this fact altogether off my mind. But it stayed, and became more and more real. Suddenly, with a start, I perceived it was real. I had to do things forthwith. I rang the bell and asked for an orario. "I shan't want these rooms. I have to go back to England," I said. "Yes, I have had bad news." 8. "We've only got to explain," I told myself 100 times during that long, sleepless journey. The thundering wheels so close beneath my head echoed, "Explain! Oh yes, explain, explain, explain!" And something, a voice to which I would not listen, urged, "Suppose they do not choose to believe what you explain." When I sat face to face with Maxwell Hartington, my solicitor, in his ink-splashed, dirty, yellow-grained room with its rows of black tin boxes, I could no longer ignore that possibility. Maxwell Hartington sat back in his chair after his fashion, listening to my story, breathing noisily through his open mouth, perspiring little beads, and looking more out of condition than ever. I never knew a man so wine-sodden and so sharp-witted. "That's all very well, Stratton," he said, "between ourselves. Very unfortunate and all that sort of thing. But it doesn't satisfy Justin, evidently. And we've got to put a different look on it if we can before you go before a jury. You see—" He seemed to be considering and rejecting unpalatable phrases. "They won't understand." "But," I said, "after all, a mere chance of the same hotel. There must be more evidence than that." "You spent the night in adjacent rooms," he said dryly. "Adjacent rooms?" I cried. He regarded me for a moment with something bordering on admiration. "Didn't you know?" he said. "No." "They've routed that out. You were sleeping with your two heads within a yard of one another anyhow. 36 you had, and she had 37. "But—" I said, and stopped. Maxwell Hartington's admiration gave place, I think, to a slight resentment at my sustained innocence. "And Lady Mary changed rooms with her secretary 2 nights before, to be near the vacant room. The secretary went into number 12 on the floor below, a larger room at 13 francs a day, and one not exposed to the early daylight." He turned over a paper on his desk. "You didn't know, of course," he said. "But what I want to have," and his voice grew wrathful, "is sure evidence that you didn't know. No jury on earth is going to believe you didn't know. No jury. Why—" His mask dropped. "No man on earth is going to believe a yarn like that. If that's all you have, Stratton." 9. Our London house was not shut up. 2 servants were there on board wages, against the possibility of such a temporary return as I was now making. Rachel was away with you 3 children at Cromingham. I had not told her I was returning to London, and I had put up at one of my clubs. Until I had had a second interview with Maxwell Hartington, I still would not let myself think that it was possible that Mary and I would fail with our explanations. We had the common confidence of habitually unchallenged people that our word would be accepted. I had hoped, indeed, to get the whole affair settled and abolished without anything of it coming to Rachel's ears. Then, at my leisure, I should be able to tell her exactly how things had come about. But each day made it clearer that things were not going to be settled, that the monstrous and the incredible was going to happen, and that Justin had set his mind implacably upon a divorce. My sense of complete innocence had already been shaken by Maxwell Hartington. I had come to perceive that we had been amazingly indiscreet. I was beginning to think we had been criminally indiscreet. I saw Maxwell Hartington for a second time, and it became clear to me I must abandon any hope of keeping things further from Rachel. I took my luggage round to my house, to the great astonishment of the two servants. They had supposed, of course, that I was in Italy, and then went down on the heels of a telegram to Rachel. I forget the wording of that telegram, but it was as little alarming as possible. I think I said something about, "Back in London for documents, shall try to get down to you." I did not specify any particular train, or indeed state definitely that I was coming that day. I had never been to Cromingham before. I went to the house you occupied on the Esplanade, and learnt that you were all upon the beach. I walked along the sea-wall, scrutinizing the various bright groups of children and nursemaids and holiday people that were scattered over the sands. It was a day of blazing sunshine, and between the bright sky and the silver drabs of the sand stretched the low levels of a sea that had its customary green-gray touched for once with something of the sapphire glow of the Mediterranean. Here and there were gay little umbrella tents or canvas shelters, and a bather or so and pink and white wading children broke the dazzling edge of foam. And I sought you with a kind of reluctance, as though finding you would bring nearer the black irrational disaster that hung over us all. And when I found you at last, you were all radiantly happy and healthy, the prettiest of families, and only your mother was touched with any gravity deeper than the joy of sunshine and sea. You and Mademoiselle Potin, in those days her ministrations were just beginning, were busy constructing a great sea-wall that should really and truly stop the advancing tide. Rachel, too, was a little apart, making with infinite contentment an endless multitude of conical sand-pies with her little tin pail. Margaret, a pink, inarticulate lump, scrabbled in the warm sand under Jessica's care. Your mother sat and watched you, thoughtfully. And before any of you knew that I was there, my shadow fell across you all. You accepted my appearance when I ought to have been in Italy, with the unquestioning confidence with which you still take all my comings and goings. For you, Italy, America, any place is just round the corner. I was kissed with affection but haste, and you got back to your sandworks as speedily as possible. I inspected Rachel too's mounds. She was giving them the names of her various aunts and uncles, and patted the crowing Margaret, who ignored me. Rachel had sprung to her feet, and kissed me, and now hovered radiant over me as I caressed you youngsters. It was all so warm, so real, that for an instant the dark threat that hung over us all vanished from my skies, to return with the force of a blow. "And what has brought you back?" said Rachel. "I had expected a month of widowhood. What can have brought you back?" The dancing gladness in her eyes vanished swiftly as she waited for an answer to her question. She caught the note of tragedy from my face. "Why have you come back from Italy?" she asked in an altered voice. "Rachel," I said, taking her arm, with a desolating sense of the futility in my gesture of protection, "let us walk along the beach. I want to tell you something rather complicated." "Is there going to be war, Stephen?" she asked abruptly. It seemed then that this question, which merely concerned the welfare of 100 million people or so, and pain, destruction, and disaster beyond measure, was the most trivial of digressions. "No," I said, "I haven't thought about the war." "But I thought you were thinking of nothing else." "This has put it out of my head. It's something disastrous to us." "Something has happened to our money?" "I wish that was all." Then what is it? Her mind flashed out. It has something to do with Mary Justin. How did you know that? I guessed. Well, it is. You see, in Switzerland we met. You met? By accident. She had been staying at the hotel on Engstlen Alp. You slept there, cried Rachel. I didn't know she was in the hotel until the next day. And then you came away? That day. But you talked together. Yes. And for some reason, you never told me, Stephen. You never told me. And you met. But why is this disaster? Because Justin knows, and he means to divorce her, and it may be he will succeed. Rachel's face had become white. For some time she said nothing. Then, slowly, and if he had not known and done that, I should never have known. I had no answer to make to that. It was true. Rachel's face was very still, and her eyes stared at the situation laid bare to her. When you began, she choked presently, when she wrote, I knew, I felt. She ceased for fear she might weep, and for a time we walked in silence. I suppose, she said desperately at last, he will get his divorce. I am afraid he will. There's no evidence. You didn't? No. And I never dreamt. Then her passion tore at her. Stephen, my dear, she wept, you didn't? You didn't? Stephen, indeed you didn't, did you? You kept faith with me as a husband should. It was an accident, a real accident, and there was no planning for you to meet together. It was as you say. I've never doubted your word, ever. I've never doubted you. Well, at any rate, I could answer that plainly, and I did. And you know, Stephen, she said, I believe you. And I can't believe you. My heart is tormented. Why did you write to her? Why did you two write and go on writing? And why did you tell me nothing of that meeting? I believe you because I can't do anything but believe you. It would kill me not to believe you in a thing that came so near to us. And yet there it is, like a knife being twisted in my heart, that you met. Should I have known of your meeting, Stephen, ever? I know I'm talking badly for you, but this thing strikes me suddenly, out of this clear, beautiful sky, and the children there, so happy in the sunshine. I was so happy with you coming. It will mean shames and law courts and newspapers, losses of friends, losses of money and freedom. My mother and my people, and you and all the work you do. People will never forget it, never forgive it. They will say you promised. If she had never written, if she had kept to her bargain, we should still have met. Stephen, you must bear with me. This is a thing, I said, that falls, as you say, out of the sky. It seemed so natural for her to write, and the meeting, it is like some tremendous disaster of nature. I do not feel I have deserved it. It is irrational. But there it is, little Rachel of my heart, and we have to face it. Whatever happens, we have to go on. It doesn't alter the work we have to do. If it clips our wings, we have to hop along with clipped wings. For you, I wish it could spare you. And she too is a victim, Rachel. "She need not have written," said Rachel. "She need not have written. And then if you had met—" She could not go on with that. "It is so hard," I said, "to ask you to be just to her. And me. I wish I could have come to you and married you, without all that legacy of things remembered. I was what I was. One can't shake off a thing in one's blood. And besides... I stopped helplessly. 10. And then Mary came herself to tell me there would be no divorce. She came to me unexpectedly. I had returned to town that evening, and next morning, as I was sitting down in my study to answer some unimportant questions Maxwell Hartington had sent me, my parlour-maid appeared. "Can you speak," she asked, "to Lady Mary Justin?" I stood up to receive my visitor. She came in, a tall, dark figure, and stood facing me in silence until the door had closed behind her. Her face was white and drawn and very grave. She stooped a little. I could see she had had no sleep. Never before had I seen her face marked by pain. And she hesitated. "My dear," I said, "why have you come to me?" I put a chair for her, and she sat down. For a moment she controlled herself with difficulty. She put her hand over her eyes. She seemed on the verge of bitter weeping. "I came," she said at last. "I had to come, to see you." I sat down in a chair beside her. "It wasn't wise," I said, "but never mind. You look so tired, my dear." She sat quite still for a little while. Then she moved her arm as though she felt for me blindly, and I put my arms about her and drew her head to my shoulder, and she wept. "I knew," she sobbed, "if I came to you." Presently her weeping was over. "Get me a little cold water, Stephen," she said. "Let me have a little cold water on my face. I've got my courage now again. Just then I was down too low. Yes, cold water, because I want to tell you things you will be glad to hear." "You see, Stephen," she said, and now all her self-possession had returned, "there mustn't be a divorce. I've thought it all out, and there needn't be a divorce." "Needn't be?" "No." "What do you mean?" "I can stop it." "But how?" "I can stop it. I can manage. I can make a bargain. It's very sweet, dear Stephen, to be here talking to you again." She stood up. "Sit at your desk, my dear," she said. "I'm all right now. That water was good. How good cold things can be. Sit down at your desk and let me sit here, and then I will talk to you. I've had such a time, my dear. Ah." She paused and stuck her elbows on the desk and looked me in the eyes. And suddenly that sweet, frank smile of hers swept like sunshine across the wintry desolation of her face. "We've both been having a time," she said. "This odd little world. It's battered us with its fists. For such a little. And we were both so ridiculously happy. Do you remember it? The rocks and the sunshine, and all those twisted and tangled little plants? And how the boat leaked and you bailed it out? And the parting, and how you trudged up that winding path away from me? A grey figure that stopped and waved. A little figure. Such a virtuous figure. And then this storm, This awful hullabaloo. Lawyers, curses, threats, and Stella Summersley Satchel like a fury of denunciation. What hatred that woman has hidden from me! It must have accumulated. It's terrible to think, Stephen, how much I must have tried her. Oh, how far away those Alps are now, Stephen, like something in another life. And here we are, among the consequences. But you were saying we could stop the divorce. Yes, we can. I can. But I wanted to see you before I did. Somehow I don't feel lonely with you. I had to see you. It's good to see you. She looked me in the face. Her tired eyes lit with a gleam of her former humor. Have you thought, she asked, of all that will happen if there is a divorce? I mean to fight every bit of it. They'll beat you. We'll see that. But they will. And then? Why should one meet disaster halfway? Stephen, she said, what will happen to you when I am not here to make you look at things? Because I shan't be here, not within reach of you. There are times when I feel like a mother to you, never more than now. And then, with rapid touches, she began to picture the disaster before me. She pictured the court and our ineffectual denials. She made me realize the storm of hostility that was bound to burst over us. And think of me, she said. Stripped I shall be and outcast. Not while I live. But what can you do for me? You will have Rachel. How can you stand by me? You can't be cruel to Rachel. You know you can't be cruel to Rachel. Look me in the face, Stephen. Tell me. Yes. Then how can you stand by me? Somehow, I cried foolishly, and stopped. They'll use me to break your back with costs and damages. There'll be those children of yours to think of. My God, I cried aloud, why do you torment me? Haven't I thought enough of those things? Haven't I seen the ruin and the shame, the hopeless trap, men's trust in me gone, my work scattered and ended again, my children growing up to hear this and that exaggeration of our story, and you, all the bravery of your life scattered and wasted. The thing will pursue us all, cling to us. It will be all the rest of our lives for us. I covered my face with my hands. When I looked up, her face was white and still, and full of a strange tenderness. I wouldn't have you, Stephen. I wouldn't have you be cruel to Rachel. I just wanted to know something. But we're wandering. We're talking nonsense. Because, as I said, there need be no divorce. There will be no divorce at all. That's what I came to tell you. I shall have to pay, in a way, Stephen. Not impossibly. Don't think it is anything impossible. Then she bit her lips and sat still. My dear, I whispered, if we had taken one another at the beginning. But she went on with her own thoughts. You love those little children of yours, she said, and that trusting girl wife. Of course you love them. They're yours. Oh, they're so deeply yours. Yours. Oh, my dear, don't torture me. I do love them, but I love you too. No, she said, not as you do them. I made a movement of protest. No, she said, whitely radiant with a serenity I had never seen before in her face. You love me with your brain, with your soul, if you like. I know, my poor bleeding Stephen. Aren't those tears there? Don't mind my seeing them, Stephen. Poor dear, poor dear. You love them with your inmost heart. Why should you mind that I see you do? All my life I've been wrong, Stephen, and now I know too late. It's the things we own we love, the things we buy with our lives. Always I have been hard, I've been a little hard. Stephen, my dear, I loved you, always I have loved you, and always I have tried to keep myself. It's too late. I don't know why I am talking like this, but you see, I can make a bargain now. It's not an impossible bargain, and save you, and save your wife, and save your children. But how? I said, still doubting. Never mind how, Stephen. Don't ask me how now. Nothing very difficult. Easy. But I shall write you no more letters. See you? No more. Never. And that's why I had to come, you see. Why I was able to come to you, just to see you and say good-bye to you, and take leave of you, dear love that I threw away and loved too late. She bit her lip and faced me there, a sweet, flushed, living thing, with a tear coursing down her cheek, and her mouth now firm and steady. You can stop this divorce, I said. But how, Mary? No, don't ask me how. At a price. It's a bargain. No, no, don't think that. A bargain with Justin, but not degrading. Don't, my dear, let the thought of it distress you. I have to give earnests. Never, dear, never, through all the dusty rest of life again, will you and I speak together. Never. Even if we come face to face once more. No word. Mary, I said, what is it you have to do? You speak as if... What is it Justin demands? No, do not ask me that. Tell me. You see, we've so much to talk about, Stephen. Tell me of all you are going to do, everything. Because I've got to make a great vow of renunciation, of you. Not to think again, not even to think of you again. No, no, I'm not even to look for you in the papers any more. There's to be no tricks this time. And so, you see, I want to fill up my mind with you, to store myself with you. Tell me your work is worth it, that it's not like the work of everyone. Tell me, Stephen, that. I want to believe that tremendously. Don't be modest now. That will be cruel. I want to believe that I am at last to do something that is worth doing, something not fruitless. Are you to go into seclusion? I asked suddenly. To be a nun? It is something like that, she said. Very like that. But I have promised, practically, not to tell you that. Tell me your soul, Stephen, now. Give me something I may keep in my mind through all those years of waiting. But where? I cried. What years of waiting? In a lonely place, my dear, among mountains, high and far away, very beautiful, but lonely. A lake, great rocks, yes, like that place. So odd. I shall have so much time to think, and I shall have no papers, no news. I mustn't talk to you of that. Don't let me talk to you of that. I want to hear about this world I am going to leave, and how you think you are going on fighting in the hot and dusty struggle, to make the world cool and kind and reasonable, to train minds better, to broaden ideas, all those things you believe in. All those things you believe in and stick to, even when they are dull. Now I am leaving it, I begin to see how fine it is to fight as you want to fight. A tiresome, inglorious, lifelong fight. You really believe, Stephen? 11. And then suddenly I read her purpose. "Mary!" I cried, and stood up and laid my hand upon her arm. "Tell me what it is you mean to do. What do you mean to do?" She looked up at me defensively, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "Mary!" I said, and could not say what was in my thoughts. "You are wrong," she lied at last. She stood up too and faced me. I held her shoulder and looked into her eyes. The gong of my little clock broke the silence. "I must go, Stephen," she said. "I did not see how the time was slipping by." I began to entreat her, and she to deny. "You don't understand," she said. "You don't understand. Stephen, I had hoped you would understand. You see life not as I see it. I wanted all sorts of splendid things, and you begin to argue. You are shocked. You refuse to understand. No, no. Take your hands off me, Stephen dear, and let me go. Let me go." "But," I said, stupid and persistent, "what are you going to do?" "I've told you, Stephen, I've told you, as much as I can tell you, and you think this foolish thing, as though I could do that. Stephen, if I promise, will you let me go?" 12. My mind leaps from that to the moment in the afternoon when, torn by intolerable distresses and anxiety, I knocked and rang and again knocked at the door of the house she occupied in South Street, with the intention of making one last appeal to her to live, if indeed it was death she had in mind. I had let her go from me, and instantly 100 neglected things had come into my head. I could go away with her. I could threaten to die with her. It seemed to me that nothing in all the world mattered, if only I could thrust back the dark hand of death to which she had so manifestly turned. I knew all along that her extorted promise would not bind her. I knew, and I let the faintest shadow of uncertainty weaken and restrain me. And I went to her too late. I saw instantly that I was too late when the door opened and showed me the scared face of a young footman whose eyes were red with tears. "Are you Doctor?" he asked of my silence. I said, "I must speak to Lady Mary." He was wordless for a moment. She died, sir," he said. "She's died suddenly." His face quivered. He was blubbering. He couldn't say anything more. He stood snivelling in the doorway. For some moments I remained confronting him, as if I would dispute his words. Some things the mind contests in the face of invincible conviction. One wants to thrust back time. Chapter 12 of The Passionate Friends by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter the 12th. The Arraignment of Jealousy. 1. I sit here in this graciously proportioned little room, which I shall leave forever next week, for already your mother begins to pack for England again. I look out upon the neat French garden that I have watched the summer round, and before me is the pile of manuscript that has grown here, the story of my friendship and love for Mary, and of its tragic end, and of all the changes of my beliefs and purposes that have arisen out of that. I had meant it to be the story of my life, but how little of my life is in it! It gives, at most, certain acute points, certain salient aspects. I begin to realize for the first time how thin and suggestive and sketchy a thing any novel or biography must be, how we must simplify, how little we can convey the fullness of life, the glittering interests, the interweaving secondary aspects, the dawns and dreams and double refractions of experience. Even Mary, of whom I have labored to tell you, seems not so much expressed as hidden beneath these corrected sheets. She who was so abundantly living, who could love like a burst of sunshine, and give herself as God gives the world, is she here at all in this pile of industrious, inexpert writing? Life is so much fuller than any book can be. All the story can be read, I suppose, in a couple of hours or so. But I have been living and reflecting upon and reconsidering the substance of it for over 40 years. I do not see how this book can give you any impression but that of a career all strained upon the frame of one tragic relationship. Yet no life, unless it is a very short young life, can have that simplicity. Of all the many things I have found beautiful and wonderful, Mary was the most wonderful to me. She is in my existence like a sunlit lake seen among mountains. Of all the edges by which life has wrought me, she was the keenest. Nevertheless, she was not all my life, nor the form of all my life. For a time after her death, I could endure nothing of my home. I could not bear the presence of your mother or you. I hated the possibility of consolation. I went away into Italy, and it was only by an enormous effort that I could resume my interest in that scheme of work to which my life is given. But it is manifest I still live. I live and work and feel and share beauty. It seems to me more and more as I live longer that most poetry and most literature, and particularly the literature of the past, is discordant with the vastness and variety, the reserves and resources and recuperations of life as we live it today. It is the expression of life under cruder and more rigid conditions than ours, lived by people who loved and hated more naively, aged sooner and died younger than we do. Solitary persons and single events dominated them, as they do not dominate us. We range wider, last longer, and escape more and more from intensity towards understanding. And already this astounding blow begins to take its place among other events, as a thing strange and terrible indeed, but related to all the strangeness and mystery of life, part of the universal mysteries of despair and futility and death that have troubled my consciousness since childhood. For a time the death of Mary obscured her life for me, but now her living presence is more in my mind again. I begin to see that it is the reality of her existence, and not the accidents of her end, that matter most. It signifies less that she should have flung out of life, when it seemed that her living could only have meant disaster to herself and to all she loved, than that all her life should have been hampered and restricted. Through all her life, this brave and fine and beautiful being was, for the most part of her possibilities, wasted in a splendid setting. Magnificently wasted, if ye will, but wasted. 2. It was that idea of waste that dominated my mind in a strange interview I had with Justin. For it became necessary for me to see Justin in order that we should stamp out the whispers against her that followed her death. He had made it seem an accidental death, due to an overdose of the narcotic she employed, but he had not been able to obliterate altogether the beginnings of his divorce proceedings. There had been talk on the part of clerks and possible witnesses. But of all that I need not tell you here. What matters is that Justin and I could meet without hatred or violence. I met a Justin gray-haired, and it seemed to me physically shrunken, more than ever slow-speaking, with his habit of attentive silences more marked, and that dark scar spread beyond his brows. We had come to our parting. We had done our business with an affectation of emotional aloofness, and then suddenly he gripped me by the arm. "Stratton," he said, we killed her. We tore her to pieces between us." I made no answer to this outbreak. "We tore her to pieces," he repeated. "It's so damned silly. One gets angry, like an animal." I became grotesquely anxious to assure him that indeed she and I had been, as they say, innocent throughout our last day together. "You were wrong in all that," I said. "She kept her faith with you. We never planned to meet, and when we met, if we had been brother and sister, indeed there was nothing." "I suppose," he said, "I ought to be glad of that. But now it doesn't seem to matter very much. We killed her. What does that matter to me now?" 3. And it is upon this effect of sweet and beautiful possibilities, caught in the net of animal jealousies and thoughtless motives and ancient rigid institutions, that I would end this writing. In Mary, it seems to me, I found both womanhood and fellowship. I found what many have dreamt of, love and friendship freely given. And I could do nothing but clutch at her to make her my possession. I would not permit her to live except as a part of my life. I see her now, and understand her better than when she was alive. I recall things that she said and wrote, and it is clear to me, clearer perhaps than it ever was to her, that she, with her resentment at being in any sense property, her self-reliant thought, her independence of standard, was the very prototype of that sister lover, who must replace the seductive and abject womanhood, owned, mastered, and deceiving, who waste the world today. And she was owned, she was mastered, she was forced into concealment. What alternative was there for her? What alternative is there for any woman? She might perhaps have kept her freedom by some ill-paid work, and at the price of every other impulse in her swift and eager nature. She might have become one of those poor neuters, an independent woman. Life was made impossible for her, and she was forced to die, according to the fate of all untimely things. She was destroyed, not merely by the unconsidered, undisciplined passions of her husband and her lover, but by the vast tradition that sustains and enforces the subjugation of her sex. What I had from her, and what she was, is but a mere intimation of all that she and I might have made of each other and the world. And perhaps in this story I have said enough for you to understand why Mary has identified herself with something worldwide, has added to herself a symbolical value, and why it is I find in the whole crowded spectacle of mankind a quality that is also hers, a sense of fine things entangled and stifled and unable to free themselves from the ancient limiting jealousies which law and custom embody. For I know that a growing multitude of men and women outwear the ancient ways. The blood-stained organized jealousies of religious intolerance, the delusions of nationality and cult and race, that black hatred which simple people and young people and common people cherish against all that is not in the likeness of themselves, cease to be the undisputed ruling forces of our collective life. We want to emancipate our lives from the slavery and these stupidities, from dull hatreds and suspicion. The ripening mind of our race tires of these boorish and brutish and childish things. A spirit that is like hers arises and increases in human affairs, a spirit that demands freedom and gracious living as our inheritance too long deferred. And I who loved her so blindly and narrowly, now love her spirit with a dawning understanding. I will not be content with that compromise of jealousies, which is the established life of humanity today. I give myself, and if I can, I will give you, to the destruction of jealousy, and of the forms and shelters and instruments of jealousy, both in my own self and in the thought and laws and usage of the world. End of chapter 12.